Let's talk and dive into researching. So the three questions that we'll sort of explore today, and I'll have Lynn sort of take the first stab at it, is how do you know if a job is right for you? What if you don't meet 100% of the qualifications listed in the job description? And how can you tell if a job posting is legitimate?
Sure, I'm happy to sort of get started and we'll just sort of go back and forth on this one. So, one of the number one things I'm hearing from students and from our employer community is that they just don't understand how to tell whether a job posting is right for them. There's a huge number of job postings out there on the internet, on Handshake and on LinkedIn and Indeed and Google Jobs and all of these other sites. And so they're having a really difficult time understanding whether or not they should even apply. So we thought it was really important to kind of tackle this topic and help you understand how to decide whether or not you should apply for a position. So the advice I like to provide to people, and Cass can totally correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is you miss 100% of the shots that you do not take. So I always encourage folks that I'm working with to apply to a position if they think that they are qualified. So we'll talk a little bit more about understanding your qualifications. But I always encourage people to apply, even if they don't meet seemingly 100% of the qualifications that are listed on there. When employers are building a job description, they're listing their ideal candidate. They're listing, as if they were ordering somebody from a catalog, which obviously is totally not realistic. There's no one that likely will meet 100% of the qualifications in a specific job posting or listing. So definitely keep that in mind, and don't let it discourage you from applying to a position. So that kind of, I guess, talks to those two first points. So determining whether a job is right for you. So I would say the way to determine if it's right for you is whether or not it's in your chosen industry field or something that's interesting for you. And if you are not meeting 100% of the qualifications, don't let that dissuade you, because you still likely hit more than you think. And there's specific ways that we'll talk about that you can tailor your application documents to show that you meet more of the qualifications than not. So go ahead, Cass.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of the information that you shared, right? You're not going to get a job if you don't put yourself out there and apply for it. So sort of related to if you don't meet 100% of the qualifications, my recommendation to anyone that I work with who are looking for jobs and who are currently in their job search is if you meet about 70 or 75% of the qualifications or more, I highly recommend putting in an application for that and tailoring your materials to really make you seem like a qualified candidate. The only time that I would ever say maybe not to apply for a position if you don't meet about 70% of the qualifications is if you don't meet educational requirements. Often those educational requirements aren't usually something that they're okay with ignoring. So what I would recommend is, if it says master's required and you don't have a master's degree, that's the only time that I would sort of be hesitant to put an application in. Other than that, if you meet about 70 to 75% of the qualifications, put yourself out there, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is utilizing and leveraging your documents and your materials to make you seem like a very qualified candidate for a job. And related to knowing if a job is right for you or not, as a career coach, I usually recommend taking some career or skills assessments to determine what might be career options that align with your skills and interests. So maybe you don't know which direction to go in. Maybe you finished up your degree or you're in the middle of your degree right now and you're not really sure what types of jobs are right for you or that you're qualified for. Career assessments and skills assessments are really great places to start. And those are things that you can take within the career services office here at UNLV. And we can sort of debrief those assessments with you and make sure that you feel more confident going into your job search and feel like you know which jobs might be right for you or a good fit for you. And then lastly, knowing about if a job is legitimate or not. I'm going to really give a lot of this to Lynn, as she does manage help manage our job posting platform, Handshake. But on the side of making sure that a job posting is legitimate, I would just do a lot of research on the company. So if you find a posting on Indeed or you find a posting somewhere online, research that company, see if they have a website, see if these jobs or this company has ever been reviewed, and that will give you a good indication as to whether it's a legitimate company and potentially job posting. That's what I always recommend to my students. Lynn, do you have any other recommendations to look at the legitimacy?
For sure. So I'd say you're definitely correct with the recommendations you're making. The internet is your friend and tool when you're going through your application process. So definitely utilize the resources that are out there when you're assessing whether or not a job posting is legitimate. Like Cass said, go to the company website. Does it look like somebody built this morning? Does it have information in there? Are the fields filled out? Does it have that like form Latin text in their fields as if they just built this and they haven't added the content? Like that's a great way to tell whether the company has a history. There's also a lot of company research websites that are out there, like Glassdoor, that provide company reviews and information. So you can always pop the company name in there and see what others are saying and talking about. One of the good things with our Handshake platform is that students can leave reviews of companies for one another. So if you choose to apply to a position on Handshake and you have an awesome experience or potentially not so great of one, you can leave a comment and a review so that your other students can be educated about your experience and provided as a resource for them. I'd say too, one of the other things I always recommend is popping the name of the company and the job title into Google too, and seeing if it comes up listed on any other job search websites. Generally, companies kind of paper the internet with job postings when they're looking to go through a robust hiring process. They want to post them in as many places as they possibly can to make sure that they're reaching potentially their chosen and targeted candidate. So if you, for example, typed like, I don't know, server at Olive Garden into Google, you would expect to see many, many, many results for that. But if you, for whatever reason, didn't see a ton of search results popped up about that one, it would probably be a red flag because you know that they're likely trying to hire somebody for this position and they want to make sure that their job posting is viewable. And Cass popped a really good resource in there for career research. So you can look into some companies and perform a little bit of research before you're going into this job search. So she just dropped that resource into the chat. Anything else to add to this topic, Cass, before we move on?
I think I'm good to go, ready to dive into some resumes.
Solid. And as a reminder too, for our audience, if you have any questions, you can drop them into the chat at any time. So we're going to move through a few different topics in this presentation. So if you have anything, feel free to drop it in there and we will do our best to answer it. So now we're going to talk about resumes. So this is probably what a lot of you jumped into this conversation to learn about is how do you use your resume? So the questions we're going to talk about on this topic are how important is your resume? What are some strategies that you can use to make it more effective? Some things that you should definitely avoid, and whether or not a bad quote unquote resume will eliminate you as a candidate. Do you want to start on this one, Cass?
Yeah, I'd love to start. So let's just kind of take this question by question, beginning with the importance of your resume, because that's really what we're myth busting today, right? Your resume is the only thing that gets you the job. And of course, that's a myth, right? That's not the only thing that gets you the job, but we'll talk about the importance of your resume first. So I like to use some statistics to sort of guide this conversation. And one thing to know is that the average job posting attracts about 250 resumes or more, right? And so the way that you create your resume to make you a good fit for a job is what matters, right? It's what's going to move you forward in the process. It's the words and phrases that you utilize on your resume. And so before sort of moving forward and to talk about the other questions, I kind of want to toss it over to Lynn to talk about the applicant tracking system and why that makes your resume important.
Sure. So the applicant tracking system is essentially a resume reading robot. So companies that are posting for a lot of positions or they are going through a really robust hiring process, for a lot of our larger companies, they will implement something called the applicant tracking system, which is, like I said, a robot. So the company sets up parameters that they tell the robot to screen for. So they'll tell it to look for specific things from the job posting itself. So specific qualifications and buzzwords. The robot reads through the applications that are coming in and being submitted into the system, and then it decides whether or not to move them forward into the next phase of the screening process. So most of the time, especially for large companies, the first quote unquote person who's reading your resume isn't really a person at all. It's a computer system. So that's something to really keep in mind when you're taking the steps in order to prepare your application materials, is that you really need to take steps to make sure that you're hitting on the factors that the applicant tracking system is likely screening for. So if you remember to our earlier topic, Cass was talking about making sure you're hitting somewhere between that 50 and 75% of the qualifications before determining whether or not you apply to a position. Generally, that same parameter is true for what the applicant tracking system is screening for also. Most of them are screening for about 75 to 80% of a match between a candidate and the factors that it's screening on to determine how it decides to move you forward in the process. So they'll set the robot to screen for educational factors, specific skills and buzzwords, years of experience, specific majors and degrees. They'll set it to screen for all of those things, and making sure that your resume is a very clear and close match for that will make sure you make it through to the next step of the process.
Yeah, I mean, I echo that completely. I think just to sort of finalize what we're saying about the importance of your resume, your resume tells the employer that you meet those minimum requirements of the job. It's the interview and the cover letter that are the two things that show them that you're a good fit, right? So your resume is sort of saying, hey, I meet these requirements. I made it through the ATS. I am qualified for this position. So sort of transitioning into how to increase the effectiveness of the resume, right? It's knowing that the ATS, that the applicant tracking system exists. So it's using keywords and phrases to match yourself to the job description. Some other ways that you can sort of leverage your resume to increase your effectiveness is by changing up the resume headings on your resume. So traditionally speaking, you have an education section, a work experience section, and that's typically, right, the most common resume headings. What you could do to increase the effectiveness of your resume and match yourself to the job posting a bit better is creating unique section headers to sort of indicate that you have the skills they're looking for. So what I mean by this is, let's say you're applying for sort of a leadership role. Maybe it's a supervisor or a management position, maybe a coordinator, an assistant director, those types of things. And you want to show this team that you have leadership skills. So what I would encourage you to do is create a section on your resume titled Leadership Experience, where you can really talk about the roles and the organizations where you took on a leadership role, and describe that to your, for this particular job. And so that type of thing can really increase the effectiveness of your resume. Any other tips, Lynn, for increasing the effectiveness of a resume?
I think you nailed it. I would say you want to take your cues from what you should include in your resume based on what they're including in the job description or the job posting, because those will be very clear factors for what it is that either the human recruiter or the robot recruiter are looking for in moving you forward to that next step. Generally, there's some other, resume hot tips that we could provide too, like limiting the length. Because most recruiters are only spending about 30 to 60 seconds reading your resume. So you want to make sure that the resume is clear and concise, and that it is of a manageable length. So what we're usually telling folks is to limit it to only one page, unless there are some very specific situations like many years of experience, or you're looking to do more of a curriculum vitae, which are both things that Cass and our career coaches can help you with if that applies to you. But I'd say other than that, you hit on most of the factors associated with making your resume a lot more effective. So we can talk, I guess, too, about some of the things to definitely avoid when you are building and structuring your resume for that application process too. So there is a very popular myth circulating around on the internet right now about a way that you can beat the applicant tracking system. And there's a myth going around that you should take all of the words out of the job description and put them into your resume, make the font white, and then submit your job application. That is a huge myth. So the reason people are pitching this as a good idea is because it'll move you past the first step of the applicant tracking system. You know, you've hit on, by doing that, theoretically, all of the buzzwords that the applicant tracking system could be screening for. However, it's a really bad idea because it assumes that the first person reading it is that applicant tracking system, and make sure that if you have your resume being seen by a human recruiter, they will find out that you did that because they'll either print your resume or they'll take a closer look at it, and they'll be able to see that you did that, which makes you look like a very unreliable and dishonest candidate, which are two factors that you definitely don't want to draw out in your job application. So I'd say that is a internet trend that we're seeing and people are asking us frequently about, that I would definitely say is a don't.
Agreed. This is something that I have talked with students and alumni and community members about, is that, you know, you definitely don't want to cheat the system, but you're really ultimately cheating yourself. And this might be the coach coming out in me. But if you are kind of taking the easy way out and you're just copying and pasting, you're not able to truly research if you're a good fit for this job, right? When you're building your resume, you're actually determining whether this is a good fit for you too. You're making sure that your skill sets align. And so if you don't take the time to do that, and you don't take the time to tailor your resume, ultimately, in my opinion, as a coach, I think that you're not only cheating the system, but cheating yourself. So that's certainly a resume don't. I'll go through some other logistical sort of don'ts. So something else that we recommend you don't do on your resume is have that general skills section, right? You write skills and then you write communication, interpersonal skills, Microsoft Word, right? And that's kind of a section that we really recommend that you avoid, that you don't use on your resume, because that's not really doing. What I recommend is integrating those types of words, right? Communication skills, interpersonal skills, organizational skills, Word, Excel, etc. Integrate those things into the bullet points that you're using to describe your experience. And so a general skills section is a pretty hot don't on your resume. Moving forward, paragraphs of text, right? You don't want to include these large, extensive, lengthy paragraphs of text to describe your experience. Instead, you want them to be quick, easy to digest bullet points, right? This makes it very easy for the employer to read in an incredibly short amount of time. Once your employer sees your resume, they take about 5 to 7 seconds to scan through it. So those paragraphs or text are not doing you justice, and you want to make sure the information is very easy to read in some bullet points. Something else you don't want to do is to engage with unreadable fonts, right? You want to stick with sort of the standard font types. These font types include Georgia, Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial, etc. And these are very easy to read fonts. Things that you want to avoid are those like Comic Sans, any cursive, anything that is unreadable or just sort of distracting in nature. A fourth thing that you want to ignore or not do is actually do not include a photo of yourself, right? So there's a lot of kind of dialogue about this, and I'll certainly let Lynn also chime in a moment. But when it comes to photos on your resume, the only time you should really be using them is when your appearance matters, right? And that's typically in modeling and acting. So if you are engaging in either of those fields and you're submitting applications for that, you may include a photo. Otherwise, you certainly want to direct people to your LinkedIn profile or your LinkedIn account for them to see a photo of you. Photos on resumes are certainly not best practice. Before I move into some other don'ts, Lynn, do you have any opinions on these photos on a resume?
Yeah, we get asked this question a lot. There's a lot of conflicting information about resume and whether or not you should include a photo on there. And I think there's some trends that sort of follow through with resumes. And for a bit, there was a trend with including a photo, and I definitely think and recommend against it. There really isn't a situation for most of the positions why the recruiters should be considering your appearance and whether or not to move you forward into the next step of the hiring process. And likely those types of positions like modeling or, things like that would be asking for a professional portfolio of photos of you anyway as a supplemental application material. So there really isn't a reason at all to be including a photo on there. And like Cass said, you can always include a link to your LinkedIn on the top of your resume, and you should have a photo uploaded there. So I would definitely discourage you from including it on there. It also can do some strange things when they're doing the resume and applicant screening process. It's not good at converting non-standard items to readable formats. So your picture it'll just break the system as it's taking steps in order to screen you and move you forward in the process. So I would definitely recommend against that.
Yeah, and that's a really great segue into some of the final don'ts that I have for resumes. And that's related to tables, graphs, charts, inserted columns, those types of things. So any of those strange formatting elements, such as tables, graphs, pictures, charts, they throw off not only the viewer, right, because it kind of diverts them from reading into viewing something, and it just moves your ability to read and scan through the document around. And so it first does that, but secondly, it also throws off the applicant tracking software. And so that system is very trained and created to read through text and text only. So we really recommend and encourage you to avoid using any tables, any graphs, any charts. If you work in a field where displaying that type of work is a necessity, right? Maybe displaying your work as a graphic designer or showing that you know how to utilize Excel and create these charts or graphs, I would recommend creating a portfolio that's separate from your resume where you can display that sort of work. That's definitely not something to include on your resume. And within the same sort of thread, don't use a template, right? Don't go to Microsoft Word or the internet and download a template and plug your information in for a couple of reasons. First, it's very challenging to edit a template. So for you on the side of creating unique resumes for each job, it's going to be very challenging to do that with a template. But second, the employers are also used to seeing these templates, and it sort of shows them that you didn't take that extra step to create your own resume from scratch. And they don't like to see these sort of generic templates circulating around. And then thirdly, the applicant tracking system is not trained to read through these different formatting features that are typically within a template. So we definitely encourage you not to use a template. And then lastly, my other sort of don't, before we transition into the last question, is don't make it generic, right? You don't want to explain your experience or skill sets in generic terms and within a very generic sort of structure. Instead, right, make sure that you're quantifying and qualifying your experience. So when you're able to put numbers, money, value, monetary value, different elements like percentages in your bullet points, that's going to make your resume stand out. Right? When you're able to incorporate specific sort of bullet points and action-oriented verbs onto your resume, that's what's going to make it stand out and become less generic. So I certainly encourage you to personalize your document with the bullet points that you're creating and the things that you're saying on your resume. And so those are some of my don'ts. Lynn, you can certainly add any in there, but I think we'll end with Lynn sort of answering the question, will a bad resume eliminate me as a candidate?
For sure. So you definitely addressed the question that has come in the chat, about those pre-made resume forms and templates. So to answer that one, it is no. There's a question in here that's coming in right now about page designs, like if you're a graphic designer. So generally, graphic designers have a bit more flexibility in coming up with a creative looking resume than people that are going into specific professional industries. So graphic designers do have a little bit more flexibility in incorporating some creative elements to show their skills as a graphic designer. But generally, like Cass said, we would recommend creating an online portfolio and just incorporating that link on your resume rather than trying to make your resume super hyper designed as a means of showing your graphic design skills. So portfolio is definitely your friend. Because it can show more information and better design samples than what it is you can show on the resume specifically. There's another question coming in right now too. Keep them coming. So anybody who has questions about resume formatting, now's a great time. We'll keep answering these as they come in. There's one talking in about adding lines or separations to separate categories. Can you talk a little bit about how to separate categories, Cass?
Of course, yeah. So two ways that I recommend sort of separating each of the sort of headings or sections on your resume is one, yeah, you can add in that line, right? If you're using Google Docs, it just says insert line and you can just insert that horizontal line. That doesn't really affect anything as long as it's not sort of an image, right? You're not inserting a line as an image, but inserting it through the Google Doc or Word document function. And that's definitely acceptable to sort of separate those. But one of the more traditional ways to separate your section is by creating the headings as bold and underlined. So you want to basically bold and underline that title and then just add a space right between each of those sections. And that will do the same job as adding a line. So it's sort of up to you stylistically which way you want to do that, but just make sure that the line is not like a word art or it's not a photo. Instead, the line is within the Word or Google Doc function. So I hope that sort of answers that question.
Yes, I definitely think so. So we'll go ahead and answer the last question on the slide, whether or not a bad resume eliminates you as a candidate. And we'll leave it open for another minute past that just to see if any other resume specific questions come in. But, you know, I think the decision about whether the resume eliminates you depends a lot on what category or what part of it is the bad part. You know, if you submit a resume that is good, like it includes the information that needs to be in there, but it's slightly long, I would not say that would, you know, eliminate you from contention or being considered as a candidate. But if you submit a resume that is built on a formed resume template builder, and it has some of those categories that we were saying to definitely eliminate, like a general skills section or things like that, I would say it probably could eliminate you as a candidate. Do you have any thoughts on that, Cass?
I echo pretty much everything you said, right? At the end of the day, it's sort of up to each unique employer and hiring team to decide if your resume is the thing that eliminates you as a candidate, but a bad resume certainly doesn't help you. And so I think if you take a lot of the recommendations and suggestions that we provided today, the effectiveness of your resume in your job search process is going to drastically improve, right? It's not to say that you're going to get an offer or an interview for every job, but I think it will certainly increase the effectiveness. A bad resume may get you through first step, sometimes depending on the specific hiring team, but I think best practice is to follow a lot of the guidelines that we suggested.
Fantastic. So I'm not seeing any more resume questions, but I will definitely address them if they continue to come in. So with that, we will move to another topic, which is all about the use of cover letters. So the point, I guess, of this content today is really to talk about how the resume is a tool in your job search, not the only deciding factor. So do you want to start on this topic, Cass?
Of course. So, right, we've definitely already busted sort of the myth that the resume is not the only thing. So let's talk about what are the other components of your application that make you a strong candidate and potentially get you the job. And the second large thing that's related to you in your job search process is your cover letter. So we'll sort of explore the different questions like what's the role of a cover letter? How does the cover letter fit into the application process? What if it says cover letter optional? And should I use the same cover letter for every application? And so sort of beginning with the role of the cover letter, I'll discuss what it is and see if Lynn has anything else to add before we transition to question 2. But essentially what the cover letter is it's your opportunity to connect you as a candidate to the job posting, right? It's sort of an advocacy tool for yourself and saying, I am a good fit for this position because, and you essentially explain that in your cover letter. Another great purpose or role of the cover letter is to explain any holes or issues that you might have in your application. So for example, let's say it's been a while since you've had a job. So maybe you have an employment gap. The cover letter is a great document for you to explain why you had the employment gap and explain why it's maybe not as big of an issue as it might Maybe you're explaining some sort of a career shift. So you're shifting from one industry to another, and you want to explain why, how you're still a good candidate, and why you have transferable skills to this new career or industry. And then another thing that you can explain with your cover letter is maybe if you don't meet a requirement or two. So let's say, for example, the job description says you need 2 to 3 years of professional experience, but you only have 1, or you don't have any yet. What you could use your cover letter to do, and a piece of it, is explain, while I may not meet the 1 to 2 years of professional experience requirement, or 2 to 3, or whatever it's asking for, I do still have these skill sets that make me a really highly qualified candidate for this job. So you can use the cover letter to explain some of these issues maybe with your application before getting to the interview. And sometimes that can really advance you to the next step, because the employer might have had these questions, but you were able to address them in your cover letter. 2 other things that your cover letter sort of does, or the role of the cover letter, is it expresses that you have strong written communication skills. A huge component of many jobs these days is writing emails, memos, creating content. And the employer wants to make sure that not only you can orally communicate in the interview, but you have strong written communication skills as well. So the cover letter certainly serves this purpose as well. And finally, the role of the cover letter at the end of the day is to bridge the gap between your resume and the job posting. It's explaining why you as a candidate fit or meet the job descriptions by providing some more details about your experience, by telling stories, by filling in those holes or gaps in your application. And essentially, it's sort of that bridge between the job posting and your resume. Anything else about the role or cover letters before we transition to question 2, Lynn? If not, you can certainly transition to the cover letters fit.
For sure. I think you definitely hit on all the points with that one I think we needed to cover. So as far as the fit into the application process, generally what we're hearing is that the cover letter is reviewed secondarily to the resume. So the employer or the applicant tracking system is reading the resume. It's deciding whether or not you meet the baseline qualifications to move to the next step. And then it's forwarding the resume and your cover letter and other application materials to the recruiter. After the recruiter receives those, because it knows that the ATS has already screened you and decided your resume is good, they will open the cover letter to make sure that they made the right choice. So at that point, your cover letter will be read by that recruiter to make sure that you are indeed a good candidate and should be in the next step of the consideration process for the potential position. So generally, we're hearing that it's being used as a secondary tool after the resume itself is initially screened, rather than it being read before the resume. So it's definitely a good idea to continue to include some of those buzzwords in it that the ATS is screening for. So keywords and phrases, because it will make sure that you do make it through to the next step of the process. So like Cass said, it's sort of the opportunity to draw a bridge between your resume and the job and reinforce to the recruiter why you should be getting an interview for this chosen position. So it's a reinforcement to what it is that we are seeing in that resume step.
Definitely.
So, yeah. What if it says that the cover letter is optional?
My take on this is to write it, right? It's not going to hurt you. If they put that information in that it's optional, they likely are open to reading a cover letter, right? You wouldn't put something as optional, or you wouldn't put something on your job description if you didn't want to take that time to read it. So write it, right? Take that extra step, but also give yourself a leg up. Take the initiative. It shows that you like to go the extra mile, that you are a person or a candidate who is interested in taking initiative and going the extra mile and going above and beyond. It looks good if you take this extra step, and it ultimately gives you that opportunity to include information about you as a candidate before the interview process, right? Share a story, provide an example, explain any issues they might have with you as a candidate. And at the end of the day, I think it would only benefit you to include this. They wouldn't write cover letter on their job description if they weren't willing and excited to read them. On sort of a similar note, if it doesn't say anything about a cover letter, but you have the option to include additional documents, you can always write one. It's up to you. Some coaches recommend not writing one because they won't take the time to read it. Other coaches say, it could only benefit you. At the end of the day, it won't hurt you. So that's up to you, sort of a judgment call. You can read more about it online if you're interested in the opinions of others about whether a cover letter should be included if it doesn't say anything at all. However, I definitely recommend it if it says optional to write one. And I see that we have a question in the chat about how long a cover letter should be. So I just wanted to quickly address that before we move to the last question. But a cover letter should be no longer than a page, unless, like we talked about earlier, if you have quite an extensive background or this is a very high level position, maybe you might have a 2-page resume, but overall cover letter, 1-page cover letters are best practice. So I hope that answers your question. And then lastly, we'll go ahead and address the question, should I use the same cover letter for every application? Lynn, do you want to go ahead and close us out with the answer to this question?
Sure, I can definitely do that. So just like we recommend tailoring your resume to the specific job, we also recommend that you tailor the cover letter as well. There will be specific items in your cover letter that make it unusable, basically, for general usage. It should have the name of the company that you're applying to. It should have the name of the hiring manager if it's available. It should also reference the specific job you're applying for. So it would be very obvious if you were using the same letter for every single job because there would be factors that were wrong. You can write cover letters that are good for specific types of jobs. So if you are a marketing student, for example, and you have experience and you're looking into jobs that are focused on social media, advertising, and media buying, you could have a cover letter that's good for each of those 3 sectors, and you modify it each time for the specific jobs. But we would definitely say that you need a specific cover letter for each of the jobs you're applying for. It's a really key step in making sure that your documents are tailored and ready to go for each of those job applications.
100% echo all of that. The more unique you make yourself, the more time that you take on these documents for your application, the better traction that you'll receive in your job search. So I definitely echo all of that. Feel free to continue to drop questions about cover letters, but we're going to transition to our very last topic, which is related to networking. So we titled this slide Network, Network, Network. And what we're going to talk about here is addressing some of the questions on the screen, right? So how can you leverage networking tools in your job search? How does networking work into our virtual world? And what tips do you have for improving networking skills? So to dive into this, I think it's important to talk about the role of networking in your job search. And that's really what we're discussing here is, right, the resume isn't the only thing. The cover letter isn't the only thing. Networking is just as important as all of the other things that we've talked about today. So let's kick it off with how can you leverage networking tools in your job search? So Lynn, do you want to kick us off with maybe talking about LinkedIn?
For sure. So LinkedIn is an awesome networking tool that you should definitely be using as a part of your job search. So like Cass said, none of these elements by themselves are the secret sauce to getting a job. They really work together in benefiting you in that process and making sure that you're making a really good impression. So the networking tools like LinkedIn really make sure that you're making a personal connection. So like Cass said in the beginning, some jobs are getting about 250 applications. Building a personal connection by networking helps move you up in that process and move you to the top of the stack of 250 resumes or applications that are being reviewed. It can also potentially make sure that the recruiter pulls your application out from that initial applicant tracking system screening and reviews it personally. So we always recommend networking whenever possible. LinkedIn, like I said, is a really good tool for this process. You can search by company for job postings on LinkedIn, and you can see everything that is that company has available. It'll also show you specific recruiters or staff members that have linked themselves to that company on LinkedIn. So I wouldn't say you should be, spamming all of the company contacts at the company that you're interested in. But if you go on LinkedIn and you see somebody on there who has listed themselves as a recruiter at the company you're applying to, I would definitely recommend reaching out to them via message and saying, hey, recruiter, use their name, obviously. I wanted to reach out and let you know that I've applied to this specific job posting. I would love to be considered for this opportunity. Here's some contact information if you'd like to contact me and talk about this a little bit farther. Making that personal connection and taking the step really shows them that you're interested and invested, and emphasizes that they should make contact with you because you're likely a really good candidate. You're not going to contact 500 recruiters the same way. So you really want to make sure that it emphasizes your interest in that company. And then it does, you reaching out to them and expressing that personal contact and personal interest really shows them that you are interested in working in that company. So there is a question in there about applying through LinkedIn. You can use the job application tools that are available on LinkedIn. That's a really great place to start applying to jobs. Generally, companies will list them on LinkedIn as well as a couple of other job sites. So I would say applying on LinkedIn is a great idea because it generally shares your LinkedIn profile with the recruiter when you apply. However, if you're going to apply on LinkedIn, you really need to make sure your LinkedIn profile is good to go. So you need it to be fully filled out. Make sure it's a really robust and good representation of who you are as a candidate, because otherwise it's not going to do anything to help you. There's a question in here that I want to pass to you. They want to talk about what should you do if the experiences that you have don't necessarily super connect. So maybe you can talk about how networking could be a tool in overcoming that obstacle.
Yeah, that's a great question. First and foremost, I definitely recommend to who put the question in the chat box to make an appointment with a career coach in career services, so we can sort of help build you up as a candidate and figure out what types of experiences we can include on your resume and how to kind of work into networking opportunities to build yourself up. But how networking, I think, plays into any candidate who maybe lacks some experience or doesn't have a ton of experience in their intended field is by networking and finding mentorship and connections with people in the field to maybe find an internship opportunity or volunteer options in their field to start to build themselves up and get more experience in the field. So specifically to that, the individual who dropped the question in the chat, I think a lot of coaching will definitely benefit you in building you specifically up as a candidate. But for others who are in a very similar boat, networking, meeting with the career services office and sort of finding unique ways to gain other experience. Maybe it's through a club or organization, it's through a mentorship opportunity, an internship, a volunteer experience. Those are some of the ways that you can sort of strategize to become a more qualified candidate on paper if all your experiences is sort of in fast food or other related jobs. So hopefully that answers your question. And since we have about 10 minutes left today, we're going to sort of filter through these last sort of two questions very quickly. So how does one sort of network in this virtual world? Well, one of the biggest ways is, of course, LinkedIn, as we mentioned. I encourage you to build a LinkedIn if you don't have one. Start to message, connect with people, start to post, build yourself up professionally there on that LinkedIn profile. Second, another really popular one is academic Twitter is what they call it, but essentially professional Twitter. By building yourself a professional presence on Twitter, following the companies, industries, influencers, those types of people in your field, and sort of gaining a following and engaging with others there on that platform. Thirdly, I definitely recommend taking this time to get comfortable in the virtual environment. So maybe inviting colleagues, coworkers, supervisors, mentors, etc., to virtual coffee and conversations, but then also maybe attending some virtual career events. So our office has been working really, really hard to figure out how we're going to continue career events and career and networking opportunities And most of those things are going to be virtual this fall. And so go visit our website and sign up for those those events through Handshake, and get more comfortable in this virtual environment, right? Inviting people to virtual coffee, having different discussions over, Google Meet, Zoom, etc., and getting it comfortable in this virtual world, because that's sort of where we are right now. And lastly, just tips for improving your networking skills before we move over into Q&A. Put yourself out of your comfort zone, right? You won't improve without putting yourself out there and without going the extra mile. Be comfortable with the unfamiliar, right? Maybe you're not familiar with networking or putting yourself out there or meeting people or connecting on LinkedIn. Once you do it, you're going to start to feel a lot more comfortable. But right, those first couple of tries or those first couple of times are going to be potentially messy, potentially uncomfortable, but the more you do it, the better that you're going to get. It's just like interviewing, right? Practice makes perfect. It's the same with networking. Maybe you practice with people who are more low stakes, right? So a friend, a colleague, a coach like us. I recommend practicing, having the virtual conversations, or practicing, an informational interview or something like that with a career coach or a friend or a mentor, because those are lower stakes, and then you'll start to feel a lot more comfortable and confident in those interactions. Additionally, understand that when it comes to networking, professionals want to help you, right? It's typically pretty flattering to them when they have somebody reach out on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'd love to learn more about where you are and who you are in your process, and how you got there, right? Maybe you're uncomfortable in the virtual world and you don't like video calls and those types of things. Start with a phone call and then move your way to video. And then eventually, when sort of the world opens up again, move into the physical in-person interactions. But adapt to the times. Understand that it's fluid. Networking is fluid, just like the world is today. The more you do it, the better you're going to get. And I think those are my general sort of coaching recommendations for improving your networking skills. With about 5 minutes left, let's go ahead and transition to our last slide, which I think is a Q&A slide. And we're open to questions, comments, concerns, anything that you all might have. And we'll close out in about 5 minutes. So lastly, I just want to thank you all for your time, and we'll wait for any questions that pop in the chat box.
So I do want to give it a sec just to see if anybody drops anything in there. But Kaz, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about networking, but for maybe people who are a little bit more introverted, that being in a social circumstance feels very unnatural and, fake to them. What can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the best way to go about, being in an uncomfortable situation or doing something that you've never done before, it's first, as I mentioned, doing it in a more low stakes environment, right? So if you feel like you're more of an introvert or you're not super great in social settings, right? Put yourself out there with people you are comfortable with, right? Maybe you need to practice your elevator pitch, or you need to practice how you introduce yourself to others. Do it with somebody that you're really comfortable with. So a friend, a family member, your mom, your dad, your partner, those types of things, people, and try it out, right? Ask for critique, ask for, affirmation in that process, and start to slowly build yourself to people who you are unfamiliar with, and build yourself towards sort of strangers. So I definitely recommend taking it slow. Talking with somebody in, career services about this discomfort that you have, and, being able to sit down one-on-one, of course, virtually right now, to build yourself up and to figure out how to gain that confidence. But I remember a few years ago, I was working with some first-year students, and I forced them to do an assignment where they had to go around campus at the time and introduce themselves to 3 people. One person they knew very, very well, one person that they were sort of an acquaintance with, so maybe somebody in class that they had seen a few times, and then a complete stranger. And through this interaction with the introverts and the extroverts alike, they all said that the more they did it in this particular path, or it was somebody they knew, somebody that they knew very well, somebody that they knew, and somebody that they didn't know at all, it became very comfortable for them going in that sort of slow progression. So that's my recommendation. for you. I do see that we have quite a few questions streaming through the chat, and Lynn definitely addressed them by responding to you all. And so let me go ahead and read this last question. As a freshman starting in the fall, should I go for bigger jobs or just internships? Emmanuel, that's a great question. I definitely recommend you probably meeting with career services or meeting with a career coach and figuring out what your experience looks like to determine what's the best fit for you. But generally, internships are typically a pretty good place to start. As a first year student, you might have some challenges getting an internship, just being so sort of young in the college process. But maybe meeting with a coach, we can sort of identify what's a good fit for you.
Awesome. So we are just about out of time. So if there are any final thoughts in there, go ahead and drop them in, and then we will go ahead and close this out. So Cass went ahead and dropped her email in there. So if you do have any questions, and mine as well, thank you. So if you do have any questions or thoughts about this, you can definitely reach out to us. And I will also go ahead and move to the final slide that has our departmental website, the link to our YouTube channel. So if you're wanting to see this recording later, and the link to book an appointment with us on our new handshake system. So if we can be of support or further information, definitely do not hesitate to reach out, and we will do our best to assist.